Hi, I'm Nimish and I'm here with Almond today for CogSciSci, and we're going to talk about the Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 transition, and how cognitive science can play a part in that, and how to almost maximise that process. So just to start off with, Neil, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself, your previous roles, your current role?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Nimish. Good to say. Finally, sit down and have a chat, albeit through Zoom. So been teaching. I've been teaching about 5 years, and then last year, primary school education, predominantly in the Key Stage 2 area. So years 4, 5, and 6. I've had experience in all kind of lovely local authority kind of schools. Nothing too crazy. Always just kind of guessing what to do and what kind of felt right, because as long as you kind of kept the masters happy, then like you could just kind of like get on with it. Read Willingham's Why Don't Children Like School probably about 3 years ago, and as I'm sure many educators can attest to, the book literally changed the whole outlook on like teaching and learning and everything like that. Started reading widely about cognitive science, really enjoying it, blogging about it. Started joined Twitter and started sharing all the ideas there and kind of getting involved in the cognitive science teaching community. Then last September I moved to the Woodland Academy Trust. We're a small little trust of 4 primary schools, South East London and one school in Kent. My role there was predominantly teacher improvement. It then kind of transferred slightly to curriculum development, which is an area that I've always been really interested in. And that's now going to be changing ever so slightly again to more the teaching and learning side of things come next September, should everything reopen as hopefully planned given the current situation. What about yourself? What's your background?
So I'm a teacher of 14 years. I teach at Wren School in Wellingborough. I'm a vice principal there in charge of curriculum assessment. It's a school I actually went to as a pupil. It's the area I grew up in when I was younger as well. So it's a town that I hold close to my heart. I've previously been just like head of science, head of physics as well, science teacher, of course, and then sort of went to work in Bedfordshire in terms of my first step onto leadership, looking at use of IT within the classroom with focus on teaching learning across the school. Helped to do some work within a free school that was set up over there, Kimberley STEM College. So lots of work heavily in science in terms of promoting science. Led a few teach meets and things like that over there, which is where I really started to get involved and interested in cognitive science. When I came back to Wren, I stumbled across EduTwitter, found it really interesting, loads of great stuff on there, and got onto Dr. Flavia Belhem from Seneca Learn, which is where I really started to get back into cognitive science and how it's applicable within the classroom. And we were lucky to have her come and present to us at Wren, and she really sort of switched us on to that evidence-informed practice and how cognitive science can have a real impact on pupil outcomes, but also pupil enjoyment of learning, and how if you get the delivery of the content right using cognitive science, students know more, learn more, and enjoy more essentially because of that. So that's sort of like my background. And in the last sort of year or so, I've been working with the new trust that we've got at the school to sort of align curricula across our 11 secondaries, which I'm sure will come up at some point today, which was
sounds like a job and a half.
Oh, it was great fun. It was great fun. So talking curriculum to begin with, how did you go about deciding the content for your Key Stage 2 science curriculum? And how much did you think about the Key Stage 3 national curriculum as a guide towards the endpoints of this, if at all?
I was going to say, when you sent this question through, I looked at it and I thought, oh, look at the Key Stage 3 curriculum. That actually would have been a really good idea. Maybe I should have done that because I didn't kind of look at it at all. I think, again, like from the CogSci kind of perspective, it's all about kind of really building on what's already come before. So for me, it was more kind of looking at, well, what does science look like in the early years, and then what does it look like in Key Stage 1, and then kind of building it up there, because I didn't want to kind of, yes, I think a natural outcome of the Key Stage 2 science should be that they are Key Stage 3 ready, but I think you don't get to that point by trying to dumb down Key Stage 3 so that it's ready for Key Stage 2. Saying that though, when you sent me through your document, I was amazed at actually how much of what we cover in the national curriculum anyway. And obviously our national curriculum, it's a little bit more rigid, I think, because it breaks it down per year group. In year 4, they are going to learn A, B, C. I think there's still ways that they could improve on that, certainly giving some examples of what it is that they want them to learn, giving it a bit more context would be useful. But I think that's kind of really helped us develop it. And I have to say, there's been some great work on Edgy Twitter, Christopher Search, Louise Cass, Mr. Badham. They've done some incredible work, which I'll make sure I'll send a link to you so you can put it in the preamble on the CogSciSci page. They've got a great document there that outlines everything that children need to know throughout the whole of the science curriculum for Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2. And then kind of from there, I played around with some of the sequencing for each unit on a kind of a macro medium term level, making sure that things came first that I think would complement things that would come later, and then kind of really building it into a proper scheme of work kind of thing. So literally in lesson 1, you will learn. In lesson 2, you will learn. As you've seen the documents, I'm hoping we'll get to a chance to get your secondary opinion on those later on. Certainly, big push on the knowledge. I think in my experience, primary science has been more about the doing of science, and when you actually break it down, they're not really doing much science. It's the kind of, oh, bicarbon soda, woohoo, and it all fizzes up. And okay, it's a great demonstration. There's a place for it in primary school. I definitely think that, but let's not kid ourselves that that's bringing, science as a discipline. That's not bringing much learning to what the kids are bringing. So heavily moving towards that knowledge rich, or I like to call it knowledge explicit kind of curriculum. And teachers seem to be really receptive to it. I was a bit anxious seeing how they do, because it's just a completely different way of thinking for some teachers, particularly I think at the primary level. How it's going to be, there's always this running joke in primary that you do as you're told in the mornings when it's your writing and your maths and you're reading. And then the afternoons, we won't come in and see you in the afternoons. Don't worry about it, free reign. And actually, we know more. I think the kids deserve better than that. They deserve to have a decent science education. And then there are certainly things as well. We look to go beyond the national curriculum where it made sense. So in our light in year 6, for example, in the national curriculum, there's no statement about learning about how the eye works, for example, but we think actually if we're talking about light and how you see things, it doesn't make sense just to go, well, light from the sun, straight line, some of it's absorbed, some of it's reflected back into the eye. Actually, your curiosity would want to go, well, how does the eye actually work, and how does that transfer, what it sees into the brain, and how all that kind of bit works. I'm going to realize that my science knowledge and doing this is not as hot as it probably could be. But yeah, so that's what I'm going to say. That document and all the work that Louise has done and Chris has done, this wedge to it is amazing because it's out there for free. Any school can pick it up, and you would have a really, really good, strong foundation of a solid kind of Key Stage 2 curriculum. I kind of feel anyway, for sure.
Yeah, I agree with loads of that. Especially the sharing the resources and that sequencing on a wider level and working with people in other schools on it. The 3 that you mentioned there, Louise, Mr. Badham and Chris, they're phenomenal people. I've seen the work that are put out there, and especially a lot of Louise's graphic organisers. They're brilliant.
They're in our little folder ready to go out. It's great.
Yeah,
what I like about them is that they're actually organised. It's not just a list of things. It's organised.
Exactly, and it follows that. Well, knowing Louise, that's exactly how she works. She wouldn't work in any other way. But it's the fact that they're so simple and they allow flexible use beyond what they've got there. A lot of resources that some people put out there, they're very context specific, yeah, context specific. They're specific for their school and where their school are at within curricula. I think one of the things that I've tried to do with what I'm doing with the schools that I'm working with is trying to make content that is generic but goes far enough into things to allow adaptations on top of it. So it's not well explained. So if we're talking about planning, it would be a medium-term plan rather than a short-term plan. So it allows adaptation to happen on a local level, which I think is absolutely crucial. And I know it's mentioned time and time again in a new framework, but I think more than just a new framework, I think local context is so important in terms of use of resources and sequencing of curricula, because nobody knows their school better than the teachers in front of the kids that are there. The teachers know the school, they know the community, they know the kids better than anyone else. So yeah, loads of great points in there. And it's interesting that you do say that that Key Stage 3 wasn't thought of necessarily as the end point. But I think when we're using documents like the national curriculum documents, invariably that they're written so that the Key Stage 3 is the end point of that. So while it's not explicitly thought of, I think the work and the time and the effort that was put into the Key Stage 2 program of study would have done that naturally. I think. So.
Yeah, I think, yeah. As I say, looking through the documents that you sent me, there was a very natural progression, almost as if like year 7 is a chance for you to undo all the things that we probably taught them wrong in primary school.
It's a bit like that first year at university, isn't it? So I always remember my first year at university, I almost did A-level maths again. And I was sitting there in the lectures thinking, why am I doing this? I know this. And I was looking around and thinking, well, that person doesn't, and that person doesn't. And it's almost like that standardized level that you just need everyone to be at, that baseline that you need everyone to be at before you can really start to kick on. And I think if those things aren't tackled early doors, then you do have this almost like jumping around of what you've got to do in your teaching to make sure that everyone is working at the level where you want them working at. So I think that first year, or that year 7, or that first term of like doing things like that, I think there's not a problem with that, as long as you understand that's what you're doing, and that you don't think, like you're saying, you're undoing bad work. What you're actually doing is making sure that everyone's at a level playing field, I guess.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us on to the really nice, that's like one of my first questions, which was all about, obviously, there's probably dozens of primary schools that feed up into Wren School. Yeah. Do you find that there's like a massive science gap, for want of a better word, between what children from different primary schools are coming up with, and like what's the, I mean, you mentioned it just before, like what's the approach to kind of tackle that to make sure everyone can kind of progress in their science education?
Yeah, so there are big gaps naturally. I mean, I think we have 36 different schools that feed into us, and it's about 5 or 6 main ones, but then there's obviously village schools and things that come into us as well. And I think the biggest gaps arise purely because of curricular decisions that have happened in these schools. So it's not a fault of anyone. It's just alignment of curricula, teacher specialisms, when things are taught within the term, whether people have thought about doing more ecology-based things in summer terms and where they can get out and actually do it. And it's things like that that lead to this. But the national curriculum being in place and programs of study by year being in place, it has helped that massively in terms of for secondary school. So gaps exist, but curricular, and they're mainly curricular gaps, but they're not major, is what I'd say. When you really dig into that, you really start to figure out where misconceptions and things become quite clear. And it again, I don't think that's through anyone's fault. You mentioned it earlier about subject knowledge, and how subject knowledge is such a key thing here in terms of misconceptions, because you could be teaching something, you could be explaining an idea and not get completely that what you're doing is feeding into a misconception, not necessarily that you have, but that a student has, because you know the knowledge, but you don't know the ways in which knowledge could come about in different ways, and the way that students might build their schemas in different ways. So one of the books that I found was this one here, Children's Ideas in Science, which is a phenomenal book. I don't know if you've come across it.
I've not, no.
It was one that was given to me by PGC actually, and there's tons of research within it about, and not just British research, but international research about how how students think about science. It goes through a lot of the knowledge, but also how misconceptions develop and common misconceptions. So some of the ones that are mentioned, it's a really old book. I think it's 2000 or something like that, but it's a really good one though. So one of the ones they talk about are, one of the misconceptions they talk about is light. So they talk about the idea of just asking eight or 9-year-olds about light and where light comes from. And some of them are saying, oh, well, it comes from the bulb. So it's in the bulb and then it comes out of it almost. And there's misconceptions about how it's like stored and released. And that's all to do with sequencing of curriculum, because if they don't get that light is a form of energy and that energy can be transferred from transformed from one form to another, they won't get what it's electricity that's causing that to happen, and X, Y, and Z processes take place. And another one is, the idea, and it's mentioned here a few times, about heat rising. It's not heat that actually rises, but it's hot air that rises, and just breaking that down, and that the sun is high in the sky because it's hot, and things like that. Misconceptions that students develop just from us teaching an idea. So if we talked about, objects that are hot rising, they'll think, oh, cool, right, that's why the sun's up there. And we don't think about those things necessarily. And it's something that just never springs into our mind when we're delivering content. So I think real research into misconceptions, especially in year 7, is something that we've done quite a bit of early doors, and we've tried to sequence some of that into our shorter term planning to make sure that we tackle these ideas often, through the use of multiple choice questions, retrieval roulettes at the start of lessons. So we can, if we slip one of these in there, we can see, well, yes, that's a mistake, that's a misconception our students have. We need to tackle that. Sorry?
So I think, just building on that point, I think that just goes to show that the benefits of really kind of thinking through and almost scripting your explanations for some of this science content, which is something that I don't see it happen much in primary, because I'd say like subject knowledge, like I do sometimes wonder if secondary schools, we are, as primary school teachers, we have 11, 12 subjects that we have to teach. Yes. And we are experts in absolutely none of them. Like, you'll get some people who have a science GCSE and like they just haven't touched science properly, and kind of put themselves into learning science again for what could be 7 to 8 years by the time they get into the classroom. So I think, and this is why I appreciate all the work, say, that Louise done, because Louise is that secondary school teacher. Everything that she can do, like I know and I have confidence that the subject knowledge that Louise has been putting down and writing, and Chris as well, although he teaches primary, he's got a background in science and secondary school teaching. I know that what's coming down is reliable, so hopefully those kind of things don't come about. But just because that we don't explicitly mention these misconceptions doesn't mean, as you say, that they don't form in the heads of the children. And I was having something where you can be more aware of what these misconceptions are. Like I would never have thought for one second, that the heat rise and that's why the sun's like in the. I would never have even considered that as a possible reason why the kids think the sun is up there. So now it's really, really, really interesting thoughts.
The best one. So I'm kind of Sorry. The best one I ever did with heat was, and this was all the way back in 2009, which is when I was first at Ren, because I left for 4 years and then came back. And it was interesting to see that this whole idea of tackling misconceptions is one of the ideas that stayed at the school in my time away. And the way I introduced it was I talked about the idea of you've got an oven and you put 2 objects in there, a wooden object and a metal object, and the oven's at 200 degrees, and you leave the 2 objects in the oven for a few hours, and nothing's going to set alight or anything there. They're just left in the oven. You pull them out and instantly you touch them. Which one's hotter? And even the teachers would say straight away, yeah, the metals could be hotter compared to the wooden spoon. But no, it's not the case. They're both the same temperature. And it's and what that really got us thinking about when we unpicked it as a group was the idea that temperature, and this ties in back to the idea of heat rising rather than hot air rising as well. When students consider temperature, or when people generally consider temperature, they think about it based on the properties of the object rather than actually the situation itself and what's taking place. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that people have in science, that they consider, it's almost like they take it too far. They go way beyond the level that is actually needed at that point. And I think that's a huge thing to consider. Sorry, Neil. Yes, you were going to ask another question.
Yeah, well, I've got so many. So I just wondered, do you ever find, obviously, CogSci, so let's bring a bit of CogSci, and so I'm sure you must know about the phenomena where you're more likely to be able to retrieve something in the place that you've learnt it. Do you find that, is that something that you kind of, as you're going this journey, is that something that you're telling your teachers? It's being, well, it may not be that they don't know it as such. It may just be because these external factors are in play that there's something that's making that retrieval strength not as strong as it could be? Or is that, do you just find that something you don't need to kind of worry about too much, but we'll plow on and kind of just reteach anyway?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and something that I remember considering when I first came across the idea, but I haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about it since. And now, just popping into my head, I can see how I could quite easily do a lot of these things. So at Ren, we're really lucky that we have a very strong primary liaison link. So we have someone in primary school, one of our lab technicians, who goes out and does primary science, but it goes beyond science now. So it involves other subjects as well, and goes and works with many of the primary schools in the area, just making that link between the start of secondary and primary. And, it's had the natural effect of boosting our numbers of people coming in, although for a while it didn't. There's a big period where we had a drop in numbers, and we were underpanned for a while for numerous reasons. And if you want to know more about that, then feel free to have a listen of the Nailers Natter that I did recently, where I talked through a lot of our school improvement strategies. But because of what we were doing there with that primary liaison link, we had an influence on curricula in these, or activities at least within curriculum in these primary schools. So where things were happening and knowledge was being taught and ideas were being discussed, we had an influence over that. So we had this lab technician going out and delivering some of the lessons there. What we haven't done enough of is getting that lab technician into our year 7 lessons. So when we're reviewing that content, it's the same person coming in there. And one of the things that so what I'm thinking right now is that I should be doing that. We should be encouraging that to happen, and taking this person saying, right, go around our year 7 lessons in the first term and start making those links really explicit. Do you remember when I told you about this? Do you remember when I told you about this? Do you remember when I came in and did this activity? And the other thing that we've only started doing recently, it's last year or two, is we've actually purchased a double-decker bus, an uncommissioned double-decker bus, and we've converted it to a science bus. So it's completely self-sustainable.
Amazing.
It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. And it's got solar panels on top of it. It's got a 3D printer inside of it. We can do science on it. It's great. It's absolutely phenomenal. We do rent it out for parties as well, which is great. And it hasn't been used. I couldn't believe it.
Now everyone knows about it, though.
yeah. Oh God, now we're going to be fully booked out, I'm sure. So what happens is we get primary school groups to come up, and they come in there and they do activities in there. And we're trying to get now year 7 and 8 to come into there as well. But what we don't do is exactly what you've said, which is actually use it as a tool for retrieval. Essentially, so do you remember when you came here and you did about acids and alkalis on the bus? Well, that's what we're doing again now, but we're taking it that step further. And I guess that is one of the ideas in terms of CogSciSci that we can implement more within our curriculum. So that's you've given me definitely food for thought there that I need to go away and work on.
Didn't want to give you any work over the summer holidays.
I've got plenty there, don't worry.
Or any more work. Yeah, no, it's interesting because I think a common thing that we kind of hear when in that first kind of half term where kids still come back in year 7, still come back to see their older primary school teacher, it's all very much the oh yeah, we're doing the same thing again, or like, oh, we already know how to like do this. And I'm wondering if okay, but they probably understand the reasons more as to why it is to, go back over it. You've had your 6 weeks off, you're in a new environment. It's kind of just just kind of reactivating, rebuilding up that schema and kind of making it, deeper knowledge. So it's not as tied down into context. So we think about the episodic memories that we have. So it's kind of making sure that it's kind of taking it from episodic to semantic because they are in this new situation. There's all the stresses going on. So no, it's a really interesting idea. And I really like the idea of getting that lab technician in that early on in that autumn term, just to kind of be that link between what they've learned in primary and what they've learned in secondary as well. Which I guess leads me to nicely again to another question that I have for you, which is what is the ultimate year 7 scientist student?
Yeah,
What does
it's
that
a
look
really
like?
interesting question. Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. And when you sent this one through to me to get me thinking, I was thinking, oh gosh, what would I actually want? And it comes back to what you were saying before in terms of some of the science that you felt has been covered in primary schools in the past, where it has been about fascination rather than knowledge necessarily. So, you know, the curiosity that students have there is more diverse rather than epistemic. And I think that's, and I'm not saying there isn't a place for diverse curiosity, because there is, definitely, because without that wide breadth of experiences, students won't have something to hang their initial thought process on. You know, they won't say, oh, I know about that from here, or I know about that from here. And
Yeah.
I definitely want students that have that almost magpie mentality regarding learning. You know, I want them to come and think, oh, I love that. But also I think that they need that motivation to really drive through thinking within a subject. So having that real base of knowledge, so that they are motivated to learn for the sake of learning. And I think that can only come from having a good knowledge base, so they can make the links. Because when students make the links, they feel success, and therefore they want to they want to do better. So in terms of like biology, when you so what I thought about was, I thought, let's take these three areas of biology, chemistry, and physics, and what is the absolute basis that I want these guys to come in with? You know, what's that level of knowledge that I want, so that we're not just getting diverse curiosity, but we're getting epistemic curiosity as well. So I'd say they need some level of literacy regarding organisms and ecosystems in biology, because if they've got a good grasp of that, they can really access the world. And I know just before we started this chat, we were talking about cells. Cells is a really interesting concept for me, because where cells is covered depends so much on your own theory of sequencing, and where and how far you're going to go into cells. So if cells historically has been one of the first topics covered in year 7 in science. However, you could talk about cells and linking photosynthesis, diffusion, respiration, all these ideas, which are not covered till later. So if you're not going to go into that detail, then fine, do cells, do the structure of a cell, mention some of the functions of the organelles, and that's fine. So, but all of that relies on massive levels of literacy to be able to understand what's going on there. And I think if year 6s are coming into year 7 with huge levels of literacy in science, being able to talk scientific language, that will mean they'll be able to access so much. In terms of chemistry and physics, for me, it's mainly models, and being able to understand what a model is, and knowing that a model isn't actually necessarily what's happening, but a representation of what's happening.
Happening.
Exactly. So analogical models is what I'm talking about here. And there's a great part in the EF secondary science improvement guide, which talks about modeling and how that is an absolutely crucial part of not only the scientific process in terms of how scientists work, but also the scientific learning process. And using models to grasp concepts is a huge idea. So yeah, models and literacy, I think, are two of the key things, and they rely on deep levels of knowledge that students have. Definitely. So that does. I think we've sequenced these questions amazingly today, and I know I'm with the king of sequencing. I know I'm with the king of sequencing today, so that makes a big difference, I'm sure. So, which areas of science do you feel are underrepresented in Key Stage 2? Because obviously, if I'm after this ideal transition between 6 and 7, we're going to need to make sure all the boxes are ticked. But it's difficult to have a look at Key Stage 2 and think, well, yeah, it's ticking every box that we need to. So where do you feel is underrepresented in Key Stage 2?
I mean, I think for me, chemistry is totally underrepresented at Key Stage 2. But then what's funny, and what I find slightly peculiar about the whole primary national curriculum, is that the curriculum doesn't break things down as this is biology, this is chemistry, this is physics. Although if you read the preamble, it reads that the kids should be taught that those things are like that. But I'm sure you knew when the new curriculum went in, no one read the preamble. They just all wanted to know what they actually got taught and stuff like that. So what I think, again, maybe what I find is that kids aren't really sure if they're doing biology, chemistry, or kind of physics yet. we break it down as things that just taking like year 6, we've got animals, including humans, electricity, evolution and inheritance, light, living things and their habitats. And so it'd be up to the individual teacher as to whether they show those as, right, animals, including human, this is looking at biology, electricity would be looking at the physics side of things, light, physics, evolution, inheritance, living things and their habitats, biology. So if you go through all of those, there is no chemistry at all there for year 6, which I think is a crying shame, because I definitely think there are some things that year 6 would definitely be capable of doing. I think particularly about chemical energy and things like that. I think those are things that kids, could, in chemical reactions and that kind of thing is definitely something that you could get kids doing. Again, talk about the preamble, I honestly think that we could get rid of evolution and inheritance and put in chemistry there if I was to be allowed to rewrite the curriculum. I don't think that kids can really appreciate hundreds of thousands of years worth of evolution, and for us to do it, properly. They could say a common misconception that I've kind of seen evolution is that kind of stereotypical picture that you get when it's ape, and then it progressively evolves to a human standing up, which is in itself it's a model, but it's a massive misconception of a model, because it implies that we are directly descended as opposed to that common ancestry of the ape. So I think get rid of evolution and inheritance and put something to do with chemistry in, looking around chemical reactions and things like that, because it's not really touched upon at all, and I think it's a pretty fundamental part.
Yeah, and in terms of modelling, like we were just talking about, there's very simple ways that lead to deep knowledge of modelling things in chemistry that can be done in year 6 relatively simply. And what that does is it not only deepens knowledge of science, but also deepens knowledge of the scientific process, which I think is one of the most crucial things that needs to happen as part of that transition, where students have knowledge of a subject, but also knowledge of the processes within it, so disciplinary and substantive knowledge. When they have both of those, that's where doors become unlocked. That's where they can really understand what a subject is all about, and make sure that they can progress within it. And I do find it really interesting that I myself agree with you that it is the idea of what would be chemistry is missing massively in year 6, and it's certainly something that I need to go back and reflect in terms of my secondary curriculum, whether that is the case. And I'm guessing for people that are listening, it's something for them to go and ask their main feeder schools. Is that something that's happening there as well? Are they not covering that? Because we're talking in broad strokes here in terms of following the national curriculum, and I know it's something that both of our schools do. However, I think part of that engagement within secondaries with primaries is crucial, especially with your main schools that are sending students up to you, so you can really dig into and see what's going on there. Definitely.
Yeah, I think what's interesting as well about our national curriculum for primary is that the number of units that you need to cover does not always necessarily correlate with the number of terms that there are in a school year, for example. So it's just got me thinking, right, we've got 5 terms here, 5 units within year 6. So actually we make sure that the summer unit is always left, where this does happen, we always make sure the summer unit is, the summer term is left clear. And the idea is that teachers then use assessment for learning, if they've done assessments or whatever, so they can go and use that time then to plug gaps. And it's made me think, actually, maybe there needs to be a lot more emphasis on retrieval within, we call it change in materials at primary, so the chemistry, or work with secondary school teachers. Right, if we could do 3 weeks of 2 years, so if we have 6 hours worth of chemistry, 6 hours of time we could give to chemistry, what could we do here to, because I guess what I think it's always important, the national curriculum is the bare minimum, that nothing stops you from going above and beyond that.
Definitely.
So CogSciSci, so get the CogSci questions in. So you said that you had Flavia come in and kind of helped you out. So what kind of, what were the tangible things that you took from having those sessions when it came to you guys developing your curriculum? And I'm more, I know booklets are quite a big thing now as well, particularly in secondary. I know that there are some primaries starting to dabble in. I'm personally a massive fan. We don't use them personally at our schools, but I think on balance they are particularly good, especially for the knowledge-heavy subjects like science, where the teachers, may not have solid subject knowledge that is needed. I think they're a useful guide. So I'd love to. Is a booklets an approach that you do? Because I know slop is a massive thing in secondary schools science now, if you kind of go down the CogSci route. So what are the tangible things that you kind of took from Flavia when she came in, when it came to your curriculum?
Yeah, so what it did is it made what was previously broad strokes really explicit things within our curriculum planning. So we started the process of reevaluating curriculum, especially around Key Stage 3, in about 2006, 2007, just a year before Flavia came in. And one of the things we looked at was our head as an old school curriculum planner. So, he'd done a lot of that sort of work before. So he had a real clear mindset about how he wanted the curriculum to look like. And he'd always talk about it like a spiral curriculum, knowledge that builds on prior knowledge that keeps going up and up and up, which is fantastic, because it does tie in a lot with CogSci and things that are happening, and cognitive science and things that are happening there. So what it did is it made those things explicit and said, well, actually, we need to think about retrieval, we need to think about spacing, we need to think about interleaving, we need to think about repeating themes. All these sort of ideas kept coming up, and it really nailed that work that we were doing on developing themes from our curriculum. So while we had that idea of, we need to revisit this topic again, when we started doing that, we didn't really think of them as, we thought of them more as still discrete topics rather than a theme that repeats. And what interleaving and what spacing and the idea of retrieval practice really did for us is make those links, is force us to make those links explicit, to say, well, that is actually linked directly to this. So why are we calling them separate things when actually it's part of the same continuation, part of the same story, essentially? And what it really did, therefore, was push the quality of explanations within the classrooms, especially around cognitive load theory. So when we had that introduction about cognitive load theory and how students can become overwhelmed within the classroom really easily, it really made us understand that we need to slow down and focus on the quality of our explanations within the classroom. Stop playing guess what's in your head. Stop doing like that, and
I
really
still do it. I still do it.
Yeah, the amount of times British Retrieval has talked to me about that, I've even seen him online saying it, or I've spoken to him about it. And I still do it every now and again. It really bugs me. I do it in my own.
You catch yourself, don't you?
yeah, definitely. And I stop myself. I'm like, damn it, why am I still doing it? But
it got to the point. I actually told the kids, if I keep on saying like, no, try again, just tell me to stop. Tell me to stop playing this game with you, and I will just tell you, because I don't know why teacher training years ago put that idea in our heads that was a good thing to do. But habits die hard, right?
It's clearly not a good thing to do. So it really focused us on making sure explanations were clear, but also like things like better use of board space and just better use of getting an idea or a concept across the student. So dual coding then became a big thing for us, which moved us towards the direction of booklets, where we started to get an idea. Well, we're just drawing the same diagram 10 times a year in every single lesson. So why are we doing it like this? Yes, there's a need for some of these to be live, but there's also some of these that can be done pre-populated. So we started moving direction of booklets. So we're not there yet. History are one of the actual departments that have got it, although science are looking at developing it this year. Mentioned that we're part of a larger trust, and I know it's something that we're looking at across the trust. But one of the things that we're really looking at in terms of Key Stage 3 and making booklets is keeping the Key Stage 2 in mind, so that we know, well, these are the topics that are covered in Key Stage 2. So these are ideas that we should be retrieving Key Stage 2 and almost feeding that in the early parts of our booklets for each of the topics that we're covering. So, do you remember this? The idea of previously on, as you've said before to me, that whole idea of previously on. I mean, it's one of the big things in our school right now. We talk about previously on and next time on, and the idea is that our booklets can be designed with those in mind.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why I like them. because you can ensure that consistency across a department or across teachers. You can make sure they always happen. And I think going that between that bridge between Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3, I think the role that we can play as primary school teachers is ensuring that kids do know when they're doing biology, they know when they're doing physics, they know when they're doing chemistry, even though our things aren't explicitly called that, because then that helps you guys, because I imagine they get a timetable that says biology, or do they get, or is it a timetable that just says science?
So it varies from school to school. I mean,
varies.
So being the timetable at my school, I know how difficult it is to do that, so I don't do it. I know that some schools do that. You know, you can split so say you have 6 periods a fortnight.
Yeah, because I imagine some kids see that and it's just like,
yeah,
okay,
exactly. So
yeah, because I imagine some kids go to year 7 and see biology, and they must go, "What on earth is biology? I was never taught anything about biology." And it's up to them to make that, and perhaps the teacher assumes they have done biology, or they're not, the year 7 teacher's not sure what constitutes as biology in the Key Stage 2 curriculum, and so again, it just kind of interferes with the models and the schemas that they have when those two clashes actually come to meet. It's like, well, I don't know what I do know what you're talking about, but I don't know what you're talking about, if you know what I mean.
Definitely.
I think what you said there about that spiral curriculum again is kind of really interesting. So it's not there yet, but one of the ways that I kind of see how our science curriculum progresses is that I think you've messaged me about this before, but about the blog that I wrote about why science should be like Game of Thrones and something like that. And so taking a Harlem's idea of like the big ideas of science, and kind of like, so what I did was like conduce those to a more kind of Key Stage 2 appropriateness. So something I'm kind of quite looking forward to is actually being able to kind of put those ideas in practice, so that kids actually know, like, this is how all of these things sequence up and how they work with biology, how it fits in with chemistry, how it fits in with physics. So I'm really kind of interested and excited to get all of that rolling up, and hopefully seeing if that idea was a good idea.
Definitely is. I'm sure it is. So one of the areas in terms of cognitive science that we find quite straightforward, I guess, in secondary is this idea of concrete examples, and the fact that, you know, we have this really clear end goal in terms of formal assessments at the end of year 11, and we have almost like this bank of questions that we know we're aiming towards, that things will be asked in this way, and this is how you write your answer, and this is how you can do it. So in terms of exam success, not necessarily just learning for enjoyment of the subject, but actually being successful in getting performance out of something for it. You know, we have concrete examples to fall back on. So without any real form of formal Key Stage 2 assessment for science, what roles do concrete examples play within sort of like design of your curriculum?
Yeah, that was a really, really good question. One that really kind of got me thinking. So one thing that we've done is that I've said there's no formal assessment, as you say. We are building in lessons for assessments, and what those will probably look like will be retrieval roulette style multiple choice questions, looking at, you know, diagrams and things like that, and making sure that those aren't just about the unit that's just been studied, but if they're in year 5 and they're doing animals including humans, making sure that the test questions look back on animals including humans from year 4 or year 3, or from living things in their habitats if it's appropriate. But another kind of thing that we do, and this is why I think the primary model is kind of really beneficial, is that as long as you tie up the sequencing of science well, you can still make those cross-curricular links to what's normally happening in the humanities. So for example, if I was teaching year 2 and I was thinking about how I want children to apply the knowledge of materials, well, if I've just done the Great Fire of London, which is a really kind of common year 2 history unit, I could then ask them about, well, you know, thinking about that context, how does your knowledge of scientific materials now reflect as to why they made those choices in the past? So why was it a leather bucket that they used? Well, because it was waterproof, because it was sturdy, because, you know, it was hard wearing, and all of those things like that. So I think that's where we can really, especially in the younger year groups, we can really kind of get those concrete examples that way. As we progress, going to upper Key Stage 2, definitely kind of get them to think about their own experiences that they see. So if they find out they've come back from a holiday somewhere and they talk to you about this exotic animal and you've already talked about adaptations, then obviously you can use those informal moments to probe out, well, how do you think it was, what was the climate like, and how do you think this animal that you saw was adapted? Or, when you're going through local parks or whatever, you can kind of find those cues, find those moments to make sure that you can ask those kinds of informal questions. But that was a really good question, one that I really kind of, made me think about a lot. To kind of what other ways can we get that and make sure that those are explicit as well. Be interesting.
I guess that links to that idea we were talking about curiosity a minute ago, in terms of that diverse curiosity that students have, because it's what you're saying there is so context specific in terms of not necessarily the curricular side of things, because that's purely by design, but in terms of local parks and things like that, in terms of students going out and seeing what's around them and their lived daily experience. That's naturally part of their schema. That's what they see day in, day out. And I think one of the things that we forget as educators is, yes, 100%, we have to deliver this massive bank of knowledge to these students that they're entitled to, that is hugely powerful in terms of this knowledge. However, that doesn't mean that we should forget about what they see daily in the world around them and how we can use that as concrete examples of applications of some of this knowledge.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Which is absolutely huge. So, and it's a massive motivational factor as well, I think. A massive motivational factor.
I think so.
Yeah,
because I think in our Key Stage 1 curriculum, lots of it, so in like the plants, I've written schemes of work where it's literally like you will go, so I did the walk around the local park for some of the schools and I was like, right, I'm going to identify, and then I got an app on my phone that was like, right, what kind of leaf is this? So I know that I'm using leaves that they're going to see, and they're going to learn how to describe those properly scientifically. They're going to know what an evergreen tree is, and they'll know a couple of examples that are in the local park. They're going to know what a deciduous tree is. They're going to know what some of those examples are in the local park. And when we get to Key Stage 2, it almost kind of flips a little bit. So it's more kind of in the abstract because of what we might be talking about. And so then it's that question then, right, can they apply what we've taught them about in this, what might be a written model or an example that isn't from the lived experience, and then can they process that down to something that they do see around them.
And I think that's phenomenal. I think that's something that secondaries potentially don't do enough of. So you got concrete examples there from all the way down in Key Stage 1 of what they're seeing every single day and hooking knowledge onto that. Well, I think sometimes secondaries are way too focused on the end game, as I mentioned, in terms of an exam question, what it's going to look like, how to script an answer for it.
Yeah.
What does that actually look? What is a concrete example of describing refraction in the best way possible actually look like? And yes, they've got to get that. However, is that the only way in? When actually there are many ways into something like refraction. So, why does that pencil look like it's broken when you put it in water when actually it's not? And those sort of ideas. And that can be used as a concrete example for a good description of refraction. So there's loads of ways into it. It's an area I'm sure we could sit and talk for an hour on.
I would love to.
Yeah, for sure.
So I was wondering, so I think I've been quite fortunate that I've had a fair bit of autonomy in terms of how I can sequence those things. And again, because the national curriculum is so well sequenced anyway, I think for primary, because it breaks it down year group by year group by year group. And so there are a few things that I think should come before the others. So in year 4, they do states of matter and they do sound. So for me, it makes a lot more sense to do states of matter, understanding of the molecular structure of a solid, liquid and gas before you then do sound. In year 5, there's gravity, or there's forces, and there's earth and space. For me, it makes a lot more sense to do forces first before you do earth and space because of gravity, etc., etc. But other than that, you don't really kind of need a science specialism to kind of arrange a curriculum in a way that could produce, say, that spiraling effect. But obviously, as a secondary school subject specialist, you've probably got lots of people with really solid subject knowledge, and so there's probably a massive clash of ideas at some point as to what comes where. And as you say, you're now trying to create some homogeny between like 11 schools. Yeah. So you're multiplying what would be a department, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 teachers, so you got all of a sudden you've got about 77 teachers trying to, that must get a bit heated sometimes. How do you arrange that? How is it not a case of maybe like too many cooks ruin the broth kind of thing, do you think?
We should tell them all what they're doing. No, that's not. So we're really lucky that the trust that I'm part of right now, they have a very much a middle up model. So the design has to come from the mid readers. So essentially, the heads of science would meet to sequence the science curriculum. And I'm not saying it was like a quick process. I mean, it was probably 3 or 4 days altogether for the bigger subjects like science, where they sequence the entire curriculum from 7 through to 11. And essentially, a lot of our sequencing conversations were based around that constant dialogue going back and forth between what goes before what. And in science, because of purely the hierarchical nature of the subject, just like you're discussing, it's actually a relatively straightforward process for most concepts. You know, for the vast majority of concepts, you need X, Y, or Z before you do the next thing. So actually, it was relatively straightforward, and I went into the process thinking this is just going to railroad the half term. It's going to be insane, and I'm so glad there's no exams to think about during this process. However, for science, it wasn't so bad. I mean, I know for other subjects it'd be really difficult. Where, say, like a history, maybe not so much geography, but definitely say like a history, where there's a massive breadth of knowledge that is required. Sequencing there becomes really difficult until you absolutely nail your themes. You know, once you've nailed your themes, you can then sequence your themes. But then even then, you know, what area of study are you going to bring in for that theme, which is, again, another question in history. So many different combinations. But in terms of science, that hierarchical nature just made it really, really straightforward and therefore really easy to sequence. And I guess that comes from that specialist subject knowledge that people have in secondary schools. You know, they get that, if I'm teaching this, I need to make sure that they know this, this, and this. And if they don't, then I need to go and plug those gaps before I move forward. And a lot of our sequencing conversations were therefore based around that concept. So aligning 11 secondaries for science took time, but not because it was difficult, took time because I wanted to get it right, I guess.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense. Yeah, and I say it's interesting. I say I'm a great believer that if you want to design something, curriculum that is coherent, like the subject knowledge has to be spot on. Yeah, and subject pedagogical knowledge as well. So in terms of like the best ways of delivering content. Yeah, I'll say they're the same but separate, aren't they? They're very reciprocal. I think one can't exist without the other, but I think it's very much possible to have good pedagogical content knowledge, but your subject knowledge still maybe being a bit off, perhaps. I don't know. So going on that, is there any kind of analogy, metaphor for any kind of content that you? So I was thinking, I watched the last CogSci site about electricity, and they brought up key stage 2 electricity and voltage, and how it's voltage is a measure of the push and not the actual current itself. Do you have any quick tips for the busy primary school teacher about any good analogies, any metaphors for any good concepts? There's so many that I know, and again, I'll recommend a book. It's really that'd be great. It's really difficult to get a physical copy of this. However, a quick Google search will show you where you can get some relatively easily, in terms of like people that have adapted content from it and put it online. So it's the BSO Science Teacher's Handbook, and essentially it's full of models for teaching different concepts. So there's ideas like using tights in a tennis ball for peristalsis, so like the process of moving food along within the digestive system. So put a tennis ball in tights, you squeeze it along, you can just show that taking place. In terms of light changing direction, I know you don't talk much about refraction in key stage 2, but if it was to come up, you could use a car going from a solid surface like a road into mud and use that as a mental model in terms of the process going on there. But there's a whole ton. I like that. So there's loads of different ones within there, and I guess it's just having a little flick through and finding ones that fit. But modelling is key for me in terms of the scientific process, and in terms of sort of like pedagogical content knowledge, in terms of the best way of teaching certain stuff. That 100% modelling is the way to go in science. And I remember running a project with some of the local primaries back in 2011, 2012,
where we worked on what would be some of the best models to use in secondaries and in primaries, and essentially we picked apart that book and found.
Oh wow, that's definitely one to get a hold of.
Yeah, it's really easy to get hold of in terms of like an online version of it, but paper copy is really difficult nowadays.
That's we're quite sorry, you finish. No, so we're quite fortunate. So come next term, again, all things being right regarding COVID, we've managed to get some staff meetings set up deliberately for improving teacher subject knowledge and teacher pedagogical content knowledge, because I just think you can give a knowledge explicit curriculum to anyone, but that's not going to result in the outcomes that you want. The teachers need to know it. They also need to know the best way how to teach the content that we're giving them. So I will definitely be getting your children's ideas in science and the science teacher handbook and giving that to our science leads to use that for those sessions.
Yeah, there's another one that I suggest as well that I don't think is I don't think we think about these things often enough, that actually it's a really simple idea that can be used, and it's something like the Osborne Illustrated Dictionary of Science. So big thick book, like 400 odd pages big, all the scientific concepts just defined, and it just makes such a difference when you're thinking that, oh, I've used this word, have I used it right? And you can just quickly flick through and have a check, because as I mentioned, that whole idea of literacy in science is such a key thing, especially in biology, and making sure that we're using terms correctly, but also using terms that are new for students so they develop their knowledge. Something like that just made a huge difference. And in terms of like, if you wanted as teachers to go through the process of learning and then reviewing, obviously Seneca is a great tool for that. I can't remember if they have a Key Stage 2 science course on there, but definitely the Key Stage 3 science course on there has got a lot of good content for developing that subject knowledge. And in terms of the Hinterland, there's Bill Bryson's written 2 excellent books based around science concepts. So The Body, which is a phenomenal book. I know Louise Lewis mentioned it recently on Twitter. It's £4 in Tesco's right now, which is about absolutely.
Oh wow!
It's a great book to purchase. And the other one is a short history of nearly everything by Bill Bryson, which essentially goes through biology, chemistry, and physics, and a lot of the history of where concepts have come about, and the stories behind. I'm a strong, and I know you are yourself as well, a strong believer in storytelling in science education. And actually, those 2 books go through that process of the story behind certain ideas in science. So when space is mentioned, you can talk about Hubble and some of the stuff that he did, Galileo and some of the stuff that he did, and it just makes the whole experience more motivating for pupils, but also more interesting. And I guess it gives teachers that feeling that yes, they know this subject, and that's really difficult for primary schools where you're teaching, say, 11 different subjects. However, I think that whole idea of constantly renewing your knowledge by just reading a book or reading an extract from a book, knowing that you've got space coming up and reading the 10 pages on space before we start that content that term makes a huge difference, definitely.
I think you're really right. And again, going to that's where we're talking about the Hinterland. That's where you can make in primary, it's obviously a lot easier. You can make sensible choices with your other subjects as well. So Earth and Space only comes up once in like year 5. So what we've done in year 6 is we have a unit. It's all about the space race, and effectively it's a unit that goes back all the way to, this is what the Greeks believed about space. This is what in the Renaissance period, this is what they believed, like Galileo, heliocentric and heliocentric, and the geocentric model. Thank you very much. I knew my son.
I'm impressed. I'm impressed. Don't worry.
But we take them through that journey of how these ideas until we get to things like Sputnik and eventually Neil Armstrong, getting on the moon and stuff. And that's kind of there just so there's that hinterland that kind of connects it to what they've learned in science, but it's also a time, because they only do that once, they only do Earth and Space as a science subject once, it's that time for them to remember all of these things again, but through a different subject and applying it. And that's where I think you can really nicely match cross-curricular. I think does have a place in things, as long as you've sequenced the subject itself as its discipline well across everything. Then of course you need to look for those natural links where you can.
And I think that's a key thing. I mean, thinking maths, I wouldn't want maths to change their sequencing because of something we're doing in science. Otherwise, it is no longer maths for maths' sake. It's not maths anymore.
Exactly.
The subject's changed. It's now maths for scientists, which is not what we want
Yeah.
maths to do. So I think it's absolutely crucial that subjects define their own sequence before we start thinking, well, is there anything we can do? And if there's nothing you can do, then all you have to look at is, can you teach it the same way? Which
Exactly.
I think is the key thing. And you mentioned Earth and space only coming at once, and I think that's one of the really interesting things across Key Stage 2, even Key Stage 3 as well. Sometimes concepts only come up, say, once, and therefore they're trickier potentially to sequence. So how did you go about managing this, apart from, say the way you sort of there, like make it that idea of the story? How else did you go about sequencing these really tricky concepts? Or are there ones that came up more often than once that were still really tricky to sequence?
Again, I think because of the nature of the curriculum, and it is very much, this is what you've got in year 4, this is what you've got in year 3, this is what you've got in year 5. It doesn't make it too tricky. And maybe I'm suffering from massive curse of knowledge here, I don't know, but in my head I'm just thinking, like, yeah, obviously there are some things within those units that you can do, or that I think you need to do. Like I mentioned earlier, in year 4 there's states of matter and sound. It makes a lot more sense to do states of matter first before you do sound, because of the relation between particles, etc. And perhaps there are some teachers perhaps that won't make that connection, because I think there's still I would say, from my previous, before the kind of the CogSci revolution hit me, science was very much done right. Well, I'm doing Egypt in history. What science can I possibly link? And then so you try and find the most crazy bolt-on thing. Oh, right, Horus was I don't know if Horus was the god of light, but right, so we'll do light then, because they worshipped Ra. I think Ra was the sun god, so they worship Ra, and like Ra is the sun god, so this would be a great time to do light. And then you can do light through the idea of shining down through a pyramid, and illuminating the pharaoh's. It's just like, yeah, no, we shouldn't really do that anymore. It's again, it's finding the balance. And I think actually that's a reason why, because children got taught science that way, so they kind of cemented that idea of light being associated with the ancient Egyptians, because it wasn't taught out of a particular context. The application and the transferability of that knowledge of light became so much more difficult for them, which is why they probably got to secondary school and were talking about light and refraction, and light travels in a straight line, and they're like, no, it comes down from the sun and it illuminates a pharaoh. And it's like, no, okay. No. But yes, there are a few things like that I think you've got to be wary of. Again, the other one would say forces in year 5. It makes a lot more sense to do forces in year 5 first before you go on to do Earth in space, because you're talking about gravity and things like that as well. So there are some ones where you have to be a bit careful, but I think predominantly, as long as, and I think this is what is really important, as long as the teacher knows what has come before, and they know how what they are teaching right now is linked. So if they're doing living things and their habitats, if they know what living things and their habitats look like a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, but not just what the national curriculum objectives say, because they're quite context free. But if you actually know what the context is, you know what the content is, you can say, well, remember when you learned about the habitat of an otter, all right, in wetlands, all right, well, we're going to build on that a little bit more. And so once you have that, I think that kind of sequence and that coherence can naturally come up. Whereas beforehand, it might be, you wouldn't even know what living things year 4 might have looked at if you were teaching living things and their habitats in year 5. And so you find that you've got a crossover, or you're doing things twice, and it can get messy. So which is why I think, us being really quite explicit is really, really helpful. And it was really interesting what you said about the reading aspect as well. So the Core Knowledge website, Edie Hirsch, they have some great class readers, science-based class readers, which are so knowledge-based. They're free to download. They're perfect for, I'd say, primary, even perhaps a few of the concepts for early secondary. And if you've seen what the Core Knowledge books look like, they're beautifully designed, it's well thought out. And so you can really get them reading for science there and getting that science literacy through. So what I've managed to do is tie up, match some of the books that they have. They don't have them for everything, but they got them for a lot of the things. Match them up to some of the content that we're doing. so we can make sure that children are, reading scientific non-fiction during these lessons, or because they are online and they're free, and we're also now all experts on online learning, we can just assign them to the Google Classroom. They've got tablets at home, they can go and read this book as well. So giving them opportunities to do that. So I'm kind of really excited about how, again, that reading of science is going to impact and implement and make a change in their thinking as well, because as I say, it's so well thought out.
I think it's so important, the reading in science. And it's interesting, SUS Geoscience on Twitter is actually Dr. Claire Dyer, who's our Key Stage 3 coordinator at Wren, and she's massively passionate about it. It's one of the things we've never really spoken about, but that we were both passionate about. And I only found out through a conversation with her on Twitter, even though I see her every day, that we're both equally passionate about. And I know she's looking at developing Key Stage 3 booklets based around like class reading and stuff like going forward. So that's, yeah, I'm sure she'll share it out there. So that will be massive. And I know that Joe T recently did a Brued on a presentation about reading and instigating form time reading and the difference it made in her school, in her trust. And I cannot push heavy enough how much difference I believe reading makes to students. It's a huge deal. It really is, because it just allows access to things that they couldn't access before. Definitely.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I think, primary schools, there needs to be that focus on reading. There needs to be that focus on reading across a wider range of subjects so that they can access everything that's going on later on. I think if kids are leaving, primary school and they're not fluent readers, something has, massively gone wrong somewhere, and it shouldn't be allowed, quite frankly, unless there's obviously particular educational need there. The majority of kids should absolutely come into year 7 being able to read fluently and understand what a non-fiction book actually is and the purposes for reading those books, being familiar with that vocabulary, as you say. Yeah.
Cool.
Right. Really tough one for you. So what I was amazed, or not amazed, what I kind of never really considered with curricula is how confined you are to an exam spec. So I was kind of thinking, if you could forget the exam spec, what does your ultimate year 5, like 5-year-old to 16-year-old kind of curriculum look like?
It's really interesting you asked that, because you've actually answered this like already in terms of something you were saying a minute ago. And I know that I'm pretty sure Ruth is going to like what I'm going to say about this as well. Ruth went to the same university as me. We both went UCL. I studied some units in Science and Technology Studies department there. And I know that Ruth did her degree within that department. I think we're actually there at the same sort of time as well, although we never met each other. And one of the things that I'd really love to see within the curriculum that I don't think exists enough in there is the whole idea of the history and philosophy of science. So,
interesting.
Like you were saying earlier about taking something from the Greeks and developing it. I mean, you mentioned the route in terms of space. That is my passion. That's one of my biggest passions. That whole idea of going from like Plato to Galileo to Copernicus to Tycho Brahe to Kepler to Newton to I probably got Brahe and Copernicus wrong way around there. Going from Newton to Einstein and then Hawking, and just going through that and really seeing that joy in the development of science, how things aren't always right, but then new evidence leads to things changing. And similarly in terms of like the atom, where there was a massive period of time where like the Greeks had this idea of an atom as this indivisible thing, and then we kind of did nothing with it until Dalton came along and found things, and then we had the idea of kinetic theory, and then Brownian motion, and how that was proved by not just people that were involved in chemistry, but also physicists came along there. And J.J. Thomson came in with his discoveries, Geiger Muller linking to Rutherford in terms of discovery of actually what the atom looked like, but actually that's just a model of the atom, not physically what it looks like. Going on to Bohr, who then added in energy levels, and Schrodinger and everything he added to it, Chadwick. All these people, all these amazing characters exist in the history of science, and through their stories we can, and actually they only exist through the stories of concepts, if you see what I'm saying. So those are sequenced in that idea, is they're developing a concept, they're developing, so that first line, that's developing our view of the universe and our view of space and our view of ideas within it. So I went down the route of Newton, Einstein, Hawking, that could have gone a completely separate route at that point. You know, I could have gone in a completely different direction, talking more about stars, talking more about the development of stars. You know, where I got to Rutherford, I went, you know, Bohr, Schrödinger, Chadwick. I could have gone in a completely different direction. I could have gone off in the direction of more nuclear physics. So, you know, touch on the Curies or anyone like that. Anything in terms of what's happening on a nuclear level. And if I had carte blanche to write a curriculum, I'd come up with those themes just very much like we're doing now. But I'd find the characters and I'd go through. I'm not saying we can't do that right now, but ideally that's what I'd love a spec to look like, so that we're constantly looking back at what has happened and how people have got to where they've got to, and therefore what we can then do to build beyond that. Because I think so much of learning is based around being able to motivate yourself and attend to the right aspects of what you're actually supposed to try to learn. And that, for me, comes from this idea of storytelling. You know, when you tell a good story, people get motivated and they get really interested in what's going on. Whenever I told the story of Galileo and Copernicus and geocentric versus heliocentric, students really got stuck into that. And it was like possibly at maximum a 4-mark question on a 60-mark. It's just a small part of it. Yet the students I taught knew that so well because they knew the story and they enjoyed that story. Yeah. And they enjoyed the debate that happened around it and how science developed to get to that point. So it's a shame, but it's, again, same with the whole idea of Rutherford discovering the atom. 6 marks, maybe 7 marks, maybe tops, very small part of the spec, 3 or 4 spec points. However, they love it because they can understand the development of science within it. So I'm not saying the knowledge isn't important. I'm saying use the knowledge as like a hook to tell the story of development, which I think is the key areas of science. So yeah, it's possibly controversial, but I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to consider within that, definitely.
Yeah, I think there's. It's making me think, where can I throw a few more scientists into our curriculum? We obviously look at a few, but no, yeah, the idea of, you say, using those as a way to hook, be an interesting thing to look at again. So thanks for giving me some work.
That's fine. Well, I think we've taken up enough of everyone's time today. Listen to this. I hope
been great.
Enjoyed this. It's been great to finally catch up with you, Neil, as well, and talk science. And I'm sure this will be only the first of many times we'll catch up. And I'm sure.
I hope so.
Yeah, I'm sure when times are a bit more back to normal, we'll be able to catch up at an event and have another chat and pick this up from where we've left off.
Perfect. Looking forward to it, Nimish.
All right. Thank you very much, Neil.
Cheers.
Oh, and if people do want to talk more to us about science, where can they find you?
They can find me on Twitter at Mr. Almond Ed. That's Mr_Almond ED. And I blog at nutsaboutteaching.wordpress.com. Where can they find you?
So I'm at nlad84, so that's one word entirely, no underscores or spaces. And the blog's available on my Twitter page, but it's essentially the researcher teacher at wordpress.blog. All right, thank you very much, Neil, and I'm sure we'll catch up soon.
Cheers. See you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.